Hello, everybody. I'm a practicing therapist and a doctoral student of psychology. Today, we're going to go over signs that you are intelligent. This was requested, and the requester had mentioned the different types of intelligence. This is not based on the IQ assessment. As you guys know, I'm a student, and assessments is something that in my program and pretty much all psychology PhD programs, you go over extensively because that's something that we need to know how to do. And then afterwards, postdoc is usually when we implement those things under certain supervision standards, typically, depending on your state, etc. But I'm pretty sure all 50 states are like that in the United States. I could be wrong, but I believe that's APA guidelines. But regardless, this is not the assessments, the IQ assessment. We're not going over those details, and obviously you can't give an assessment on YouTube, and I would never do that. So that's not what we're talking about today. I have talked about assessments in the past regarding autism. All of these types of intelligence is recognized in research. And so I think it's fair to talk about and kind of break up the research together. One other disclaimer, and then we're going to jump into it. So you can probably see that typically I wear mascara. I'm not wearing mascara today. However, I wore mascara last night, so like it probably is a little bit smudged or something. So it's bothering me a little bit. So I take off my makeup pretty well, but last night for some reason it was just irritating me, so I only did it a little bit. And so you can probably see it's a little bit smudged on the underline of the eye. So I'm probably gonna it might be like bothering me a little bit throughout the video. So I apologize for that if that gets annoying, but I just don't like if there's residual makeup. But for some reason last night it was irritating my eye. So I just only did a little bit of it. And I typically only wear mascara, but I don't always wear it. And some videos I don't wear it. You guys know that. But anyways, the first one is openness to experience and building knowledge. So this research was developed based on the 5-factor model of personality, and that's a huge, that's a lot of samples because in psychology so many people use that model. So across multiple large samples, we saw in this research that openness to experiences, so it was broken up into curiosity, intellectual engagement, and imagination, does consistently correlate with measured intelligence. So this was the intelligence that was measured by standardized testing, especially knowledge-based, how would I even describe it? Knowledge-based ability and memory. Those people who scored pretty high on those types of things, as well as like abstract reasoning, etc., they tended to be more curious. And so interesting enough, they were not as stuck to their own views. They were more open to hearing other people's views. It's almost like they were less negative to certain aspects. They weren't as bitter. They were more open to understanding they could be wrong or that something can be learned more extensively. And I really like that one because I find that to be true. Of course, trauma does play a role in how people respond to new information. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so the next one here is self-control and life outcomes. Again, this is also based on a number of things. However, I do want to keep in mind that there's limitations in terms of trauma. Trauma can affect these things. However, this study was a very lengthy study, and what happened was they followed. So this was a developmental study, psychology and multidisciplinary. They followed 1,000 individuals, which I think one of you guys asked before, is 55K a large sample size? The one I talked about before is like a huge sample size, right? And I think I had mentioned that may have been 20 years, throughout 20 years, but it wasn't. I just misspoke that previous video. But these sample sizes are very large. I don't think you guys some of you guys might not know how hard it is to get participants. And a lot of times we have to get certain regulations. I don't even want to get into it because it's going to stress me out because then it makes me think about my dissertation. But this one is 1,000 individuals that were followed from birth to adulthood, which is so cool. And the researchers found that childhood self-control predicted adult outcomes. So that included academic success, income, health and lower crime rates. And this was even after controlling for IQ and socioeconomic status. However, self-control is not correlated to IQ itself. However, it strongly predicts life outcomes, and it does seem that those individuals who are a little bit higher in terms of those factors and that were tested, also with executive functioning, et cetera, and impulse control, we do see that that does have a correlation to how individuals do result in life. Again, we're not specifically talking about trauma. And speaking of executive function, a lot of individuals who may be divergent from, what's more typical, neurotypical, neurological, they also may have a different outcome as well. And that wasn't necessarily tested as extensively. So it's just important to keep that in mind. People are so different and we have so many variables that it's really hard to distinguish so many things at once. And that's why I like to use multiple types of research. If you guys haven't noticed, most videos and most things that I write, summaries to script for these videos, I always use multiple sources of research because just using one still doesn't feel like it's accurate enough. And of course, nothing I say is 100% accurate. That's not possible. But I still want to make sure that I'm touching on as much pieces as I can in a short video. The next one is humility, which is similar to the first one we talked about to some extent. And this had a lot of, this one did use IQ that was scored or also perceived from other people. And basically what happened is they wanted to recognize a term that they use as intellectual humility. And they wanted to recognize, it was really specific about the first point we talked about. This one is specifically one of those subpoints, recognizing that you're wrong. And I think all of us have done that a lot of times. And so it's good to know that this does signify some sense of intelligence. The ability to recognize I might be wrong. Right? That's pretty much all that this was testing. And this was across multiple studies. It showed that individuals who are more comfortable saying that and doing that, especially over time, they actually show better reasoning performance, less biased thinking, and greater openness to evidence. And some of these are tested in IQ testing. The next one is working memory and intelligence. Okay. So this model of working memory, this is about a couple of variables. Okay. Central executive, and there's this sort of loop functioning that can happen, and then also how we perceive things visually. So those are the three factors, but basically the central functioning, and then kind of how we perceive things, and then how we remember things. We can look at it like that. You guys can read the research in the description box. So those are the foundations of cognitive psychology and neurology from this one model, okay? So then based on that, there was decades of research showing that those working memory aspects, those variables that we just talked about, were strongly correlated with more fluid intelligence, which shows that working memory is one of the strongest cognitive predictors of intelligence. And there was a variable that was cited. However, I wrote it in an interval. I didn't write the actual one they put in the research because I think there was another research I was looking at. And so you guys can just look at it in the papers. It might be in the abstract because usually you have to write those things in the abstract. So you guys might be able to just click it and see that information. The next one is verbal ability and general intelligence. It was kind of hard to determine what that meant. It's in the research what it was cited. This research, they use the variable, the letter G, to cite general intelligence. So you might see that in the research. That's just what they're talking about. And we saw that aspect was demonstrated by the verbal reasoning. And what we also saw is it was heavily factored on academic and occupational performance. So verbal ability and being able to correlate that with yourself and having those expectations of others to some extent, because that's how you connect with other people, that does predict academic and occupational performance. However, we can obviously assume that trauma can play a very large role in this one, so I didn't want to touch on it too much. But yes, strong verbal reasoning and understanding and correlating with other people, etc., is a pretty reliable marker of this general intelligence that we're speaking of that can predict academic and occupational performance. And that is a type of intelligence, okay? The next one, you guys might have seen this research before because it has been... she has done a lot in this space about gifted intelligence, etc. So you might be familiar with her work. And so she basically has worked with the gifted population, when they were described as gifted when they were younger. And she wanted to kind of see how they become as adults. And if they truly have that intelligence that adults can be scored for, tested for, and viewed as, etc. And what she found was really interesting is folks who are gifted adults from her description. And she finds that these highly intelligent people actually may prefer solitude and deep thinking. And while this, I don't know how to explain it, the correlation is still limited. It's not casual, but it's not necessarily as direct. And so a lot of people get confused with what it means, like correlation does not equal causation. Some people get that really confused. It's a scale. And so if something correlates, that doesn't mean they cause each other. I think you guys understand that. However, some things can indirectly cause one another, which makes it a little confusing. So something that is correlation that's not causation at all is like ice cream sales go up in summer, and so do, I don't know, swimsuits, like swimwear sales. So those two sales go up, but they don't cause each other, right? The actual variable that correlates, that makes this flux and this change, is summertime, right? But summer does have some cause that creates these two variables to be increasing, right? So summer does have that relationship. However, they don't have that relationship with each other. A lot of people don't understand that. And so a good example in psychology is trauma, even though it's not fully as direct. People who have experienced trauma, for example, they tend to socially isolate themselves. Not that this is a little bit of a tangent of what we're talking about right now, but just in general, because a lot of you guys watch a lot of my videos, so this may help in general when we're talking about research. Trauma does sometimes have a lot of correlation that may cause certain aspects that occur in adulthood, right? Poverty, a lot of people who come from poverty can struggle with more social, like emotional regulation and social skills. Not all the time, right? But we do see that there is some aspects. Sometimes it's indirect. I may have to make a separate video on that. We were talking about, the correlation of this is indirect, but there is some evidence to it. So what I'm trying to say is highly intelligent folks, intelligent in of itself may not cause the choice of solitude. Other aspects that may be correlated to intelligence may create that solitude. So for example, people who are highly intelligent, they may have not fit in with their peers. And so they eventually had decided to choose solitude. That can happen. However, many other folks who are intelligent, they may have not had issues necessarily connecting with their peers because maybe they were comfortable talking in certain situations, or it didn't bother them as much. Maybe they were less neurotic by disposition, etc. And so they may have not ended up in that situation. That is one aspect, and that's a limitation of this, among other things. There's plenty of limitation in research, but it's still common. Most people who are intelligent prefer time alone, and we can look into that more in other videos. Another one is adaptive thinking, and it's the last one. Sorry, this video got longer than I expected. A lot of individuals who seem to be intelligent and are scored intelligent in a lot of different ways, they actually perform better on these types of aspects. They can switch between strategies. So that's cognitive flexibility, by the way. And then they can update their beliefs. We talked about that like 2 or 3 times in this video already. They can update and renew their beliefs to some extent. And what actually happens is they learn from their mistakes quicker, and they're more able to adapt. I think people know this, but it's nice to have the research behind it, okay? So all of the research is in the description box. I hope this video is helpful to somebody. Please like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.